Throughout American history, our country has struggled with both racial and domestic violence. Both causes typically were left unspoken about and remained hidden from the public eye out of fear of the consequences. It wasn't until the 1950s when both movements surfaced and were finally brought the national attention they deserved. This couldn't have happened without the powerful efforts of Mamie Till Mobley that ignited the civil rights movement, as well as the countless women who were finally brave enough to speak out about the violence they often experienced at home. By the 1960s, both racial violence and domestic violence were finally being talked about thanks to these courageous women.
Both Mamie Till Mobley, a member of the civil rights movement, and members of the battered women's movement used the media to spread their cause. They spoke out about their concerns for children in familial situations with domestic violence, making their cause relatable to all Americans with children. Not only did both groups use the media as a device to gain support and spread information, but also both played into a stereotype that portrayed women as weak, helpless, and ultimately victims. Rather than fighting this stereotype, they were able to use it in order to gain the sympathy of people all across the country and motivated them to support the movement.
Mamie Till Mobley and the women involved in the women's suffrage movement were both able to achieve their goals by using common stereotypes of women to their advantage. By putting themselves in the role of the victim, damsel in distress, etc., they were able to grab the attention of the media and, more importantly, the nation. This helped both parties gain support through sympathy, which was extremely effective.
Mamie Till Mobley was one of the first people to be brave enough to stop trying to hide the ugly aspects of racism, but rather publicize them, forcing the country to react to the racial inequalities that existed in America by starting the civil rights movement. In addition, Mamie presented herself as a victim in the media. African American and white mothers throughout the nation sympathized with Mamie Till Mobley, because every mother could relate to the fear and pain of losing a child.
Emmett Till was only 14 years old when he was brutally murdered for whistling at a white woman in Mississippi.
This is Mose Wright. I am the uncle of Emmett Louis Till. Sunday morning, about 2:30, someone called at the door. And I said, "Who is it?" And he said, "This is Mr. Bryant. I want to talk with you and the boy." And when I opened the door, there was a man standing with a pistol in one hand and a flashlight in the other hand. And he asked me, did I have two boys there from Chicago? I told him I have. And he said, I want the boy that done all that talk.
For the summer of 1955, Emmett Till, a young African-American boy, was lynched. This tragic murder was one of the first causes to motivate and inspire the African-American and white communities to begin a social movement for racial equality, later known as the Civil Rights Movement. Lynching was a common practice in the South during this time, but what set this murder apart from the countless others was that his mother, Mamie Till Mobley, put all of her efforts and pain into spreading awareness about this horrific event. It was one of the first times an event of this nature had gotten so much attention from the media.
Emmett Till became a national icon and furthermore an example of the racism, inequality, and unjust violence in the South and all over the country. Although previous to Emmett Till's lynching, there had been countless violent acts against African Americans with no convictions or repercussions. What made this lynching different than previous cases was not only his youth, but also the amount of media coverage the story gained through his mother's valiant efforts. Rather than trying to move past the horrific events of her son's death, Mamie tried to draw as much attention to the cause as possible. Somehow she translated her devastation into motivation and was able to use her son as an example. Once Emmett's body had returned to Chicago for the funeral, Mamie decided to host a public, open casket funeral. This attracted thousands of African Americans, all of whom were brokenhearted by the violent death of this young boy. Mamie not only made the image remain in the minds of those who attended the funeral, but she circulated photos of her son's mutilated body. She felt that this was the drive the African American community needed to fuel the movement for equality. The murder of Emmett Till inspired the Birmingham bus boycott and catalyzed the entire civil rights movement.
I looked at Mr. Rayner, and Mr. Rayner wanted to know, was I going to have the casket opened? I said, oh yes, we're going to open the casket. He said, well, Miss Bradley, do you want me to do something for the face? Want me to try to fix it up? I said, no, let the people see what I've seen. I said, I want the world to see this, because there's no way I could tell this story and give them the visual picture of what my son looked like.
Mamie traveled around the country to spread awareness about her son's murder. Her efforts motivated people to send thousands of letters that protested the Mississippi case verdict to the White House. A record number of people joined the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The lynching of Emmett Till and the injustice of the murder trial angered African Americans. Even more importantly, Mamie directed her speeches at mothers, both African American and white. In one speech, she said,
"We cannot afford the luxury of self-pity. My top priority now is to get on with the building process. We must teach our children to weather the hurricanes of life, pick up the pieces, and rebuild. We must impress upon our children that even when troubles arise, they must be anchored so deeply that though they sway, they will not topple."
This speech, like so many others she gave, was targeted towards mothers. Even white mothers were sympathetic because the topic of children was common ground. This one in particular evoked sympathy because even though Mamie lost her only child, she was still looking out for other children. White Americans were moved by the loss of a young mother's only child. Mothers all over the country, both African American and white, were sympathetic of Mamie Till because she lost her only son. This was so important for the movement because white mothers could relate to the concern of the safety of their children, whereas most of them probably couldn't relate to a lot of concerns that African Americans had during that time, concerns like racial segregation and inequality. This made the whole cause relatable to everyone, whites included. After years of hiding their abuse, in the 1960s, women finally publicized it in the media, portraying themselves as victims. Women embraced the stereotypes that depicted them as weak and helpless, which only helped gain national attention. In addition, they spoke out about being mothers, and about the fear they had for their children's safety in a violent home, helping them acquire more supporters, many of whom were women and sympathized with their cause. Second-wave feminism was a period of feminist activity that first began in the early 1960s in the United States. The movement was originally called the Women's Liberation Movement and lasted through the 1980s. First-wave feminism mostly focused on suffrage, overturning legal obstacles to gender equality, and gaining voting and property rights. Second-wave feminism focused more on social equalities instead of political ones. It focused on women's sexuality, family, the issue of domestic violence, and equality in the workplace. Second-wave feminism mainly focused on the battle against domestic violence with hopes to establish marital rape laws, rape crisis and battered women's shelters, and changes in custody and divorce law.
Now is almost 94. Was married to my father. He was a doctor. All of his patients loved him. But at home, he was a very different person. And my father basically, he'd do terrible things to my mother in front of the people who worked for us. And whether you're married to someone or not, if someone says no, it means no. So a husband can rape his wife. So in fact, all of those things happened. And my mother finally left him.
In the Chicago Tribune, members of the battered women's movement were recognized for their struggles in an article published on November 20th, 1974, called Women's Movement Just Sputtering Along. The article highlighted examples of women who were embracing the stereotypes that labeled them as weak, helpless, and dependent on men. We've externalized the enemy, men, to such an extent we've become dependent on him.
In the same article, Grace Atkinson publicly shared her struggle with domestic violence. She said she's bruised and battered from her struggles, both physically and mentally, but that it must be done.
In another article, the Battered Wife Campaign, focusing on a woman charged with murder, published in the New York Times on August 12, 1977. A Clementon resident, Miss Miller, told the story of her neighbor, Roxanne Gay, who was charged with the murder of her husband following a night when she had been brutally beaten by him. Miss Gay pleaded not guilty in the case, which served to dramatize the plight of battered women throughout the country. Women from the movement used this opportunity to talk about the battering of women and domestic violence publicly. They used this chance to spin the news of this man's murder into something beneficial for their cause. Women throughout the country hoped that this case would be the catalyst for future legislation stating that wife abuse is a criminal act, not just a civil offense. We want society to know that they gave Roxanne no alternative, because she went through all the right legal channels and medical channels and was told it was just a domestic problem. Although Miss Gay repeatedly called the police to protest against beatings by her 6'5", 225-pound husband, the most they did was to make him leave the house to cool off, after which he came back to beat her again. We are the products of the society that tells us violence is the way to solve problems, that if we are beaten, it is shameful. We want people to know about Roxanne. We want to help battered women break the silence by letting them know that there are safe places to go for help, and there is support available all over the country.
Mrs. Bernstein, her husband owned the largest moving company in the entire country. They had Matisse paintings in their bathrooms. She came up to my mother after she left and said, "He puts me in the closet and locks me in for days at a time, but I don't have the courage to leave." So these women, not only was in classes, they were literally, if they didn't get out, they were victims in secret. I mean, it was this dirty secret.
In addition to portraying themselves as victims and stereotypical women, they talked about their concerns for children in abusive situations. These women also pointed out that domestic violence existed in all socioeconomic classes. This made their cause relevant and relatable to people from all different backgrounds. They said, "We want to try to get women and their children out of a situation before the cycle sets in, and the children have that as a role model and carry it into their own lives." "People assume that wife beating goes on in poor neighborhoods," said a nurse in the emergency ward at Holy Family Hospital. "I know of a lawyer who beat his wife with a golf club. What could be more middle class than that?"
Feminist art goes along with the whole issue, all of the issues of feminism, because it was about, just as my mother really couldn't tell her secret, and these women couldn't tell their secret, feminist art was saying, we're not keeping secrets. We're making personal public. It was almost like saying we're not going to take it anymore, and acknowledging. I mean, what feminist art did was acknowledge the past, but it really was also saying, this is who we are, and we're not apologizing.
While both racial and domestic violence still exists worldwide, without the valiant efforts of Mamie Till Mobley, along with the numerous women involved in the battered women's movement, both of these issues would be more prevalent today. Thanks to these women, domestic violence is now a very serious crime rather than a civil offense. Similarly, racial violence has also come to be a criminal offense with harsh consequences. Both movements were the products of years of oppression and lack of power in violent situations. As Mamie Till Mobley said, 2 months ago, I had a nice apartment in Chicago, I had a good job, I had a son. When something happened to the Negroes in the South, I said, that's their business, not mine. Now I know how wrong I was. The murder of my son has shown me that what happens to any of us, anywhere in the world, had better be the business of us all. That's exactly what she did with her son's murder case, and is exactly what the women from the battered women's movement did to raise awareness about their cause. They made people all over the country feel like what happened to U.S. citizens was their responsibility, regardless of their race or gender.
The catalyst that started the civil rights movement. Because when people saw what had happened to this little 14-year-old boy, they knew then that not only were men, black men, in danger, but black children as well. And it took something to stir people up and let them know that we're either going to stand together or we're going to fall together.